The studio buzzed with anticipation as the audience settled in for another night of sharp wit and celebrity banter. Jimmy Kimmel, the seasoned host, thrived in this environment, his charm and quick tongue a perfect match for the talk show's blend of humor and probing questions. Tonight's guest was no ordinary figure. Elon Musk, the enigmatic billionaire, sat across from him, his presence alone enough to spark whispers among the crowd. Known for his bold ideas and unfiltered opinions, Musk was a wild card, and the tension in the air hinted at something explosive. What could possibly go wrong when two titans of influence shared the same stage? Would their egos clash, or would they find common ground in the spotlight? The segment began smoothly enough. Kimmel leaned into his opening, tossing light jabs about Musk's ambitious ventures, from space travel to brain-computer interfaces. The audience chuckled, and Musk responded with his trademark half-smile, deflecting with dry humor. But beneath the surface, a current of unease simmered. Kimmel, ever the provocateur, steered the conversation toward a topic that had been dominating headlines: the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. It was a subject Musk had championed for years, warning of its dangers while simultaneously pushing its boundaries through his companies. Why would Kimmel choose such a loaded topic? Was he baiting Musk or simply chasing ratings? As Kimmel pressed, his questions grew sharper. He referenced recent public concerns about AI's potential to disrupt jobs, manipulate information, and even threaten democracy. His tone carried a hint of skepticism, as if questioning whether Musk's warnings were genuine or merely a ploy to stay relevant. The audience sensed the shift, their laughter replaced by murmurs. Musk's posture stiffened, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the armrest. He countered with data, citing studies on AI's exponential growth and the need for regulation. But Kimmel wasn't satisfied. He leaned forward, his smile thinning, and asked whether Musk's own companies were contributing to the very chaos he claimed to fear. The accusation hung in the air, bold and unyielding. Was Kimmel calling Musk a hypocrite? Musk's response was measured at first. He explained his vision for responsible innovation, emphasizing the balance between progress and caution. But Kimmel doubled down, his voice laced with mockery as he suggested that Musk's warnings sounded more like science fiction than reality. The jab landed hard, and the audience gasped. Musk's eyes narrowed, his calm facade cracking. He leaned forward, his voice low but cutting, and accused Kimmel of trivializing a global issue for cheap laughs. The studio fell silent. The host's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, pivoting to a commercial break. As the cameras cut away, the tension between the two men was palpable, a storm brewing just out of view. What had Kimmel unleashed? Would Musk let the slight go, or was this the spark that would?
If you're on Team Musk or Team Kimmel, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. Enjoy the rest of the story.
The commercial break did little to cool the charged atmosphere in the studio. The audience, still reeling from the sharp exchange, whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between the empty stage and the crew bustling in the shadows. Jimmy Kimmel, ever the professional, adjusted his tie and flashed a practiced grin as the show resumed, but the glint in his eye betrayed a flicker of unease. Across from him, Elon Musk sat rigid, his jaw tight, his earlier humor replaced by a steely resolve. The brief pause had only deepened the rift, and the stage was set for a clash that would test both men's composure. Kimmel launched back into the conversation with a deliberate shift, veering away from artificial intelligence to probe Musk's recent ventures in social media. The topic was no less contentious, tied to Musk's outspoken views on free speech and his efforts to reshape online discourse. Kimmel's questions were laced with insinuation, suggesting that Musk's push for unrestricted dialogue was a reckless gamble, one that amplified division and misinformation. He leaned into the audience, playing to their murmurs, and painted Musk as a man out of touch with the consequences of his ideals. The host's tone was playful but pointed, each word a calculated jab meant to provoke. Musk, however, was no longer in the mood for games. His responses grew clipped, his voice carrying an edge that cut through Kimmel's theatrics. He argued that open dialogue, however messy, was the bedrock of progress, and that silencing voices only entrenched power. The audience leaned forward, caught between discomfort and fascination as Musk's intensity filled the room. Kimmel, sensing the shift in momentum, pivoted to a more personal angle. He questioned whether Musk's wealth and influence made him blind to the struggles of ordinary people, a jab that drew a mix of cheers and gasps from the crowd. The accusation was bold, but it carried a sting of truth that hung heavy in the air. The tension escalated when Kimmel, emboldened by the audience's reaction, made a cutting remark about Musk's public persona, calling him a self-styled savior who thrived on chaos. The words were rude, delivered with a smirk that dared Musk to retaliate. The billionaire's face darkened, his hands clenching briefly before he leaned forward. In a voice cold and precise, Musk fired back, accusing Kimmel of pandering to a system that profited from division while pretending to champion the common good. The retort was a direct hit, exposing the host's reliance on sensationalism. Kimmel's smile wavered, and for a moment, the studio was a vacuum of stunned silence. The audience held its breath, sensing the confrontation teetering on the edge of something unforgettable. As the segment barreled toward its next break, the question lingered: how much further could this go before one of them broke? The silence that followed Elon Musk's biting retort lingered like a held breath. The studio charged with raw energy. Jimmy Kimmel, caught off guard by the billionaire's piercing accusation, scrambled to regain control as the show hurtled toward its next segment. His laugh was forced, a thin veneer over the sting of being called out. The audience, now fully invested, shifted in their seats, their earlier amusement replaced by a hunger for what came next. The line between host and guest had blurred, and the stage felt more like a battleground than a talk show set. Kimmel, determined to steer the narrative, opened the next segment with a question about Musk's influence on public opinion. He framed it carefully, suggesting that Musk's outspoken nature, while bold, often sowed confusion rather than clarity. The question was a trap, designed to paint Musk as reckless, and Kimmel's delivery carried a smug confidence. He leaned back, expecting to reclaim the upper hand. But Musk was done playing defense. His response was immediate, his voice steady but laced with disdain. He challenged Kimmel's premise, arguing that the real confusion came from media figures who twisted truth for applause. The jab was pointed, and the audience gasped, sensing the gloves were off. The conversation spiraled as Kimmel pushed harder, his tone growing sharper. He brought up Musk's recent public feuds, implying that his combative style alienated more people than it inspired. The host's words were laced with condescension, as if Musk's ideals were a childish fantasy. The audience murmured, some nodding in agreement, others bristling at the hostility. Musk's eyes flashed with barely contained frustration. He countered by dissecting Kimmel's role in shaping narratives, accusing him of cherry-picking stories to fit a preconceived agenda. The exchange was rapid, each man's words cutting deeper, the civility of the talk show format fraying at the edges. Then came the moment that tipped the scales. Kimmel, sensing he was losing ground, made a personal dig, mocking Musk's relentless ambition as a desperate need for attention. The remark was cruel, delivered with a smirk that invited the audience to laugh. But the room fell quiet instead, the hostility too raw for humor. Musk's face hardened, his silence more menacing than any shout. When he spoke, his voice was low, venomous. He turned Kimmel's accusation back on him, exposing the host's reliance on celebrity feuds to stay relevant. The words were a scalpel, slicing through Kimmel's carefully crafted persona. The audience erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps, the energy chaotic and electric. Kimmel's face flushed, his control slipping as the segment ended abruptly, the cameras cutting to another break. The confrontation was no longer a debate, it was personal and the fallout was inevitable. The abrupt cut to commercial left the studio in a state of suspended chaos. The audience, caught in the whirlwind of the escalating clash, buzzed with nervous energy, their whispers a mix of shock and exhilaration. Jimmy Kimmel, his face still, flushed from Elon Musk's devastating verbal strike, paced briefly behind the desk, his usual composure unraveling. The crew exchanged wary glances, sensing the show was teetering on the edge of derailment. Musk, meanwhile, sat motionless, his expression unreadable, but his presence radiating defiance. The break was a fleeting reprieve, but the battle was far from over. As the cameras rolled again, Kimmel attempted to reset the tone. His opening quip was light, a half-hearted attempt to diffuse the tension, but it landed flat, the audience too gripped by the earlier fire to laugh. He pivoted to a new topic, zeroing in on Musk's vision for the future, specifically his plans for sustainable energy. The question seemed neutral, a chance to steer the conversation to safer ground. But Kimmel couldn't resist a barb, suggesting that Musk's lofty goals were more about branding than genuine impact. The dig was subtle but deliberate, a way to claw back dominance without reigniting the full blaze of their earlier spat. Musk's response was calculated, his voice calm, but laced with an undercurrent of contempt. He laid out his company's measurable contributions to renewable energy, citing numbers that left no room for doubt. Then, in a move that caught everyone off guard, he turned the tables, questioning Kimmel's own commitment to the issues he claimed to champion. The accusation was sharp, implying that the host's activism was performative, a prop for his public image. The audience stirred, some clapping in support, others shifting uncomfortably. Kimmel's smile tightened, his eyes betraying a flicker of anger, as he realized Musk was once again flipping the script. The exchange grew fiercer as Kimmel, stung by the implication, fired back with a pointed remark about Musk's wealth, accusing him of using philanthropy as a shield for his controversial actions. The comment was harsh, meant to wound, and it drew a mix of boos and cheers from the crowd. Musk's composure cracked, his voice rising for the first time as he unleashed a torrent of frustration. He called out Kimmel's hypocrisy, exposing the host's reliance on corporate sponsors whose practices clashed with his on-air moralizing. The words were a thunderclap, each one landing with precision, and the audience roared, the energy in the room reaching a fever pitch. Kimmel, visibly rattled, tried to interrupt, but Musk's momentum was unstoppable. As the segment lurched toward another break, the host's authority was crumbling, and Musk's unrelenting assault had turned the show into a spectacle of raw confrontation. The studio lights seemed to burn hotter as the show barreled into its next segment, the air thick with the fallout of Elon Musk's blistering takedown. Jimmy Kimmel, his polished veneer now visibly frayed, gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles pale. The audience, electrified by the unrelenting clash, hung on every moment, their earlier allegiance to the host splintering under the weight of Musk's relentless offensive. The crew, sensing the show was spiraling beyond control, moved with quiet urgency, their faces a mix of awe and apprehension. What had started as a talk show interview was now a raw, unscripted reckoning. Kimmel, desperate to regain footing, opened with a question about Musk's personal life, a risky pivot meant to humanize the billionaire and shift focus from the ideological battlefield. He probed into the pressures of Musk's high-stakes ventures, framing it as concern, but with a thinly veiled jab at his relentless drive. The question was a miscalculation. Musk, still simmering from the earlier exchange, saw through the tactic. His response was curt, dismissing the inquiry as irrelevant before redirecting the conversation to Kimmel's own platform. He accused the host of using his show to amplify divisive narratives while dodging accountability for the consequences. The charge was bold and the audience gasped, some leaning forward, others exchanging stunned glances. Kimmel's patience snapped. His voice rose sharp and defensive as he accused Musk of arrogance, claiming the billionaire believed himself above scrutiny. The remark was personal, laced with venom, and it drew a polarized reaction from the crowd. Some cheered the host's fire, others booed his aggression. Musk's eyes glinted with something dangerous. He leaned forward, his voice low but piercing, and delivered a scathing rebuttal. He exposed Kimmel's reliance on scripted outrage, calling him a puppet of the very systems he claimed to critique. The words were ruthless, each one stripping away the host's carefully curated image. The audience erupted, the noise a chaotic blend of support and dissent, as Kimmel's face reddened, his control slipping further. The confrontation reached a boiling point when Kimmel, cornered and furious, made a fatal mistake. In a moment of unchecked anger, he mocked Musk's vision for humanity's future, calling it delusional and out of touch. The insult was crude, a low blow that silenced the room for a heartbeat. Musk's response was immediate, his voice steady but searing. He turned the mockery back on Kimmel, dismantling the host's career as a cycle of pandering and provocation, all for fleeting relevance. The audience roared, the energy tilting decisively in Musk's favor. Kimmel, visibly shaken, signaled for a break, his authority in tatters as the cameras cut away, leaving the studio in a state of stunned disbelief. The commercial break felt like a fleeting pause in a storm, the studio pulsing with the aftershocks of Elon Musk's relentless verbal assault. Jimmy Kimmel, his face a mask of barely contained fury, conferred briefly with a producer, his gestures sharp and urgent. The audience, now a sea of divided loyalties, buzzed with anticipation, their murmurs a mix of disbelief and exhilaration. Musk sat calmly, his posture relaxed, but his eyes burning with unshakable resolve. The show had become a crucible, and as the cameras flickered back to life, it was clear the final act would leave no one unscathed. Kimmel, determined to salvage his dignity, opened the segment with a forced smile, attempting to pivot to a lighter topic. He asked Musk about his hobbies, a desperate bid to diffuse the hostility and reclaim the show's usual charm. But the attempt was futile. The audience was too invested in the drama, and Musk was in no mood for pleasantries. He brushed off the question with a curt remark, then seized the opportunity to escalate. He challenged Kimmel's entire platform, accusing him of exploiting public trust to push narratives that served his own interests. The accusation was a grenade, lobbed with precision, and the audience gasped, their reactions a chaotic blend of cheers and murmurs. Kimmel's temper flared, his voice cracking as he shot back, accusing Musk of dodging accountability for his own controversial decisions. The retort was fierce, but it lacked the sharpness of earlier exchanges, betraying the host's growing desperation. Musk pounced, his response a masterclass in controlled aggression. He dissected Kimmel's career, exposing the contradictions between his public persona and the corporate machine that propped him up. Each word was a calculated blow, stripping away the host's credibility. The audience leaned forward, riveted, as the power dynamic shifted irrevocably. Musk was no longer the guest, but the one commanding the stage. The breaking point came when Kimmel, cornered and outmaneuvered, lashed out with a final reckless jab. He called Musk a chaos agent, blaming him for stoking division with no regard for the consequences. The words were raw, dripping with contempt, and they hung heavy in the air. Musk's face tightened, but his response was devastating. In a voice that cut through the noise, he turned the accusation back, accusing Kimmel of thriving on division while hiding behind a mask of humor. The retort was a public unmasking, humiliating in its clarity, and the audience erupted, many rising to their feet. Kimmel, his face ashen, stood abruptly, gesturing for Musk to leave. The billionaire rose, unhurried, his parting glance a silent challenge as he walked off the set, leaving Kimmel alone under the unforgiving lights. Elon Musk's departure from the stage left a void that swallowed the studio whole. The audience, still reeling from the seismic confrontation, sat in stunned silence, their earlier cheers fading into a collective intake of breath. Jimmy Kimmel stood alone, the spotlight harsh against his pale face, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the desk. The crew, frozen in place, exchanged glances, unsure how to navigate the wreckage of a show that had spiraled far beyond its script. The air was heavy with the weight of what had just transpired, a clash that had stripped away pretenses and laid bare the fragility of the host's carefully curated image. Kimmel, grasping for control, forced a laugh and addressed the audience, attempting to spin the chaos into a joke. His voice wavered, the humor hollow, and the crowd's response was tepid at best. Some clapped out of habit, but others sat stone-faced, their loyalty shaken by Musk's unrelenting dismantling of the host's persona. Kimmel tried to pivot, introducing the next segment with a strained segue, but the energy in the room was gone. The audience's attention lingered on the empty chair where Musk had sat, his absence a louder statement than any words he could have added. The show limped forward, but the spark that had defined it was extinguished. Backstage, whispers spread. like wildfire. Crew members recounted the confrontation in hushed tones, some marveling at Musk's audacity, others questioning whether Kimmel could recover from such a public humbling. The billionaire, meanwhile, was already gone, his exit as unapologetic as his performance. Social media erupted, clips of the exchange ricocheting across platforms, each one amplifying Musk's final devastating takedown. Commentators dissected Kimmel's missteps, noting how his attempts to provoke had backfired, exposing his reliance on cheap shots and scripted outrage. The narrative shifted decisively. Musk emerged as the victor, not through volume but through precision, his words a mirror that forced the host to confront his own contradictions. As the show drew to a close, Kimmel delivered his monologue with a subdued tone, his usual charisma dimmed. The audience clapped, but the applause lacked conviction, a polite gesture for a man who had lost more than a debate. In the days that followed, the incident became a cultural touchstone, a moment where authenticity triumphed over artifice. Musk's refusal to bow, his willingness to call out hypocrisy in the face of power, resonated with those who craved unfiltered truth. Kimmel, for his part, would rebound, but the shadow of that night lingered, a reminder that even the sharpest tongue could be outmatched. The stage was clear, the battle won, and the world watched as a new kind of courage took center stage.